I always thought life would get easier after the divorce. No more fights, no more reproaches, no more constant feeling that you're doing something wrong. But no one warned me that loneliness could be even harder, especially when you're a mother and your child's whole world depends on how well you're holding up. Friday evening at our house was usually quiet. My son Zach, who had just turned 19, would happily play computer games or watch his favorite series while I prepared dinner or cleaned up after a long work week. But that day, I didn't even have the energy for that. I kicked off my shoes, barely dragging myself to the bedroom. My bed, with its simple but cozy cover, looked like it was calling me. Dinner? No. Tonight was going to be takeout pizza. Cleaning? Pushed to tomorrow. All I wanted was to close my eyes and disconnect for a few hours. Zach walked into the kitchen as I was pouring myself a glass of water. "Mom, you look exhausted," he noted, opening the fridge. "Yeah, it was a tough day," I replied, waving him off to avoid going into details. My job at the city archive seemed boring from the outside, but it was as exhausting as working on a construction site. Zach muttered something about how we should take a day off and go somewhere, but I just gave him a tired smile. We both knew those were empty words. When I finally made it to bed, the house had already sunk into its usual evening quiet. Zach had gone to his room. The light from his monitor slipped through the crack under his door, filling the hallway with a soft blue glow. I closed my door, plunged into darkness, and literally collapsed onto the bed. Sleep took me quickly. I didn't even dream. That happens when you're so exhausted that your consciousness just shuts down. But that night, something changed. Somewhere in the half-sleep, I heard a quiet knock at the door. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the knock came again, light, barely audible, as if whoever was knocking didn't want to wake me, but still hoped for a response. "Mom?" The voice was quiet, a bit hesitant. I forced myself to sit up, feeling sleep still pulling me back under the covers. The room was dark, but I could see the door slightly open. "Zach, is everything okay?" He stood in the doorway, faintly lit by the hallway light. He was wearing the same t-shirt I'd seen him in earlier, and gray sweatpants. He looked lost. "Sorry for waking you," he said, fiddling with the edge of the door. I can't sleep." "What's wrong?" I asked, now fully awake. Zach shrugged, like he didn't know how to explain. I gestured for him to come in. He walked over, moving carefully as if he were afraid to disturb something important. "Lie down if you want," I offered, patting the edge of the bed. Zach sat down beside me, and I noticed him rubbing his hands as if he were cold. I wanted to ask something more, but I saw something new in his eyes, a strange tension, as if he held back words he didn't want to say. "Is everything all right?" I asked gently. "Yeah, just sometimes I feel like I did something wrong," he replied, not looking at me. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "About the divorce. Maybe if I'd been different, things would have turned out differently." Those words cut deeper than I'd expected. I turned to him and took his hand. "Zach, your father and I made that decision because we stopped being happy together. It has nothing to do with you. You've always been a wonderful son." Zach nodded, but a shadow of doubt lingered in his eyes. He lay down beside me, pulling the blanket up to his chin. I didn't know what he was thinking, but something in his expression worried me. And that night, in the complete silence of our home, I realized life was preparing something unexpected for me. The next morning, sitting at the kitchen table, I tried to focus on my work. My old laptop hummed quietly, and a cup of coffee sat beside me, almost untouched. Zach came down the stairs with his usual sluggishness. He yawned and stretched, his shirt lifting to reveal the lean young frame he was growing into. "Good morning," he said, giving me a faint smile. "Good morning," I replied, trying not to reveal the fatigue that weighed on me after a sleepless night. He sat across from me, resting his chin on his hand, watching me. I tried to ignore his gaze, but it became harder with each passing second. "Mom, are you all right?" "Yes, just a lot of work." I lifted the coffee cup, pretending to be absorbed in it. Zach nodded but didn't look away. His eyes, the same blue as his father's, seemed unusually focused. Was it worry or something else? If you want, I can help, he offered, raising his eyebrows. Thanks, but I'll manage. You go do your own thing, I replied with a smile, hoping he'd find something else to occupy him. He slowly stood, poured himself a glass of orange juice, and went out to the backyard. Even through the glass door, I could feel his presence. He stood on the porch, gazing at the sky as if searching for answers to some unspoken question. That evening, I suggested we watch a movie together. It had been a while since we'd spent time together. Zach looked surprised, but agreed, quickly bringing a blanket from his room. We settled on the couch in the living room, putting on something light and funny. You don't mind? He asked, draping the blanket over both of us. I shook my head. Not at all. For about 15 minutes, we watched the movie in silence. But I barely noticed what was happening on the screen. My mind was occupied with thoughts of that night and the changes between us. Zach looked at me again, his gaze as open as it had been when he was a child, seeking comfort after a bad dream. Mom, I'm glad we have these moments, he said softly. Me too, I replied. His hand brushed mine by accident, and instead of pulling away, he left it there. There was something strange yet natural about the gesture. At some point, the movie ended, but we didn't move. The room was filled with the warm glow of the fireplace. Zach turned to me, his eyes shining softly in the dim light. Mom, he began, but trailed off. What, Zach? I turned to him, surprised by the hesitation in his voice. He shook his head, as if deciding whether or not to continue, and in that moment I saw something new in his gaze, something subtle yet powerful. I just wanted to say thank you for everything, he finally managed, forcing a small smile. I felt my heart tremble. It was such a simple thing, yet so important. Without thinking, I hugged him, as I had when he was little. This time it felt different. He lingered, not letting go, and then shifted back slightly to look at me. And in that moment, something happened that I hadn't expected. Zach gently brushed a strand of hair behind my ear, his eyes searching mine for some kind of sign. Before I could say anything, he leaned forward and touched my lips with a light, almost fleeting kiss. It lasted a second, no more. I pulled back, surprised and confused. I'm sorry, he said softly, moving away, his face flushed. I don't know why. It's okay, I replied, struggling to control the emotions surging within me. I stood up, pretending to adjust the blanket, and went to the kitchen, leaving him alone. But my thoughts remained there, with him, in the strange, unexpected silence that had just shattered the familiar flow of our lives. The next day was gray. Heavy clouds hung over the city, as if nature itself sensed the tension that had built between me and Zach. We barely spoke in the morning, each of us trying to stay busy, avoiding crossing paths. I washed dishes while he reviewed his study notes. The house was quiet, except for the gentle patter of rain against the windows. By lunchtime, I could no longer stand the silence. As I approached his room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. Zach was sitting on the floor by his bed, looking at old photos. What are you doing? I asked, hesitating to step inside. He looked up, then motioned for me to come in, just remembering. I sat down beside him, glancing at the photos in his hands. Family photos. The three of us, smiling at the beach. My ex-husband Charlie looked so happy back then. It's hard to believe that was so long ago, Zach whispered, running his fingers over the image. Sometimes the past feels closer than it really is, I replied. He set the photos aside and turned to face me. Mom, I wanted to apologize for last night. I tensed, remembering the moment we'd both avoided discussing all day. Zach, it's all right. We don't have to talk about it. No, I need to. I don't know what came over me. It was wrong. His words were sincere, filled with regret, but there was something else. A desire to understand what had happened between us. Let's just forget about it, I said, though I knew it was a lie. Forgetting was impossible. In the afternoon, the rain picked up. I'd always liked listening to the raindrops tapping on the roof, but today it felt less calming, more unsettling. Zach suggested going for a walk. In this weather? I asked, surprised. Yes, it'll help us both clear our heads. We put on rain jackets and stepped outside. The air was fresh and cold, and the sidewalks glistened with water. We walked in silence, listening only to the sound of the rain. "Mom," Zach began as we stood under a small awning in a nearby park. "Have you ever felt like you didn't know how to deal with what's inside?" I thought carefully before answering. Yes, of course. There are moments when emotions overwhelm you, and it feels like there's no place for them in reality. "That's exactly how I feel right now," he admitted, lowering his head. "I'm confused." "You don't have to figure it all out right away," I said, trying to sound gentle, but he looked up, his eyes full of emotions. "No, Mom, I can't keep it inside any longer." At that moment, he stepped closer. We stood under the awning, sheltered from the rain, but not from our feelings. "I don't know what this is," he continued, his voice trembling, "but it's something important." My heart clenched. This was not the conversation I wanted to have, but I knew I needed to listen. "Zach," but he interrupted me. "I know it's strange. I know it's not supposed to be like this, but I can't pretend nothing's happening." His words were honest, but I still didn't know how to respond. Before I could say anything, he took another step. His hand reached out slowly, as if to touch mine. "No matter what you say," he whispered, barely audible, "I just want you to know how I feel." I allowed him to hold my hand, though a storm raged inside me. He leaned closer, and I could feel his breath. This moment felt surreal and frightening. Zach rested his forehead against mine, then quickly pulled back, as if afraid of his own boldness. "Sorry," he mumbled, stepping away. I took a deep breath, letting go of all the thoughts swirling in my head. "Let's go home," I suggested, trying to bring us both back to reality. Zach nodded, and we headed back. But the words spoken in the rain couldn't be taken back. The house felt both like a shelter and a cage after our rainy walk. In the evening, we sat in the living room. The TV murmured softly in the background, but neither of us paid any attention to it. Zach held a mug of hot tea I had made for him, though he barely drank it. I stared out the window where the rain had slowed, leaving shimmering trails on the glass. "Mom," he began, breaking the tense silence. I turned to him slowly. His face was serious, even a bit troubled. "Yes?" He set the mug down on the table and sat upright, clasping his hands in front of him. His eyes met mine, and I knew this conversation would be different. "I know the last few days have been strange. I know I might have said or done something that put us both in an uncomfortable place." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. "But I don't want this to break us," he continued. "You're not just my mom. You're my person, my home." His words were simple, yet they carried such depth that for a moment I forgot how to breathe. "Zach, I'll always be your home," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "But you have to understand, we need to move forward, both of us." He looked at me, his gaze full of questions, but I could tell he understood. The next day, I decided we both needed a change of scenery. I suggested that Zach and I take a trip to the market, a place I'd been wanting to visit for a while. He seemed surprised, but agreed. We drove along a winding road out of the city, while the sun finally broke through the clouds, bathing everything in a golden light. The market was bustling. People moved from one stall to another, enjoying the vibrant colors of autumn. I picked out some fresh apples while Zach stood nearby, watching me. "Do you miss the past?" he suddenly asked, breaking the light-hearted atmosphere. I paused, thinking over his question. "Sometimes, but I try to remember that the past is just a lesson, not a place to live." He considered my words carefully. "I think I need to learn to look forward," he admitted, lowering his gaze. "It's hard, but it's possible," I replied gently. When we returned home, dusk was already settling. We unpacked our purchases, and I suggested making an apple pie. Zach laughed when he heard my idea. "A pie? You haven't baked anything in years." "It's never too late to start," I said with a smile. We worked together, kneading the dough, laughing at my attempts to remember a recipe I'd long forgotten. For the first time in days, the house felt light again. When the pie was ready, we sat down to enjoy its warm aroma. Zach, as usual, ate quickly, and I couldn't help but smile. "Zach?" I called out as he finished the last piece. "Yes?" He looked at me, and the heaviness I'd seen before had faded from his eyes. You'll always be an important part of my life, but remember, your life is your own path, and you need to find it. He nodded, and I saw understanding in his gaze. That night, I lay in bed, listening as the house settled into silence. We had both taken a step forward, but it was only the beginning. Zach went to his room, and for the first time in a while, I felt like everything was going to be okay. Life was complicated, but it always offered choices. And today, we both chose to move forward, leaving behind the shadows that had held us back. I closed my eyes, allowing myself, for the first time in days, to fall into a peaceful sleep. Through the wall, I heard the muffled sound of music coming from Zach's room, and I knew that tomorrow would bring us both even more light.